So I think we can get started, and thanks everyone for being with us today for our third and final Carbon Sense series on carbon programs available to you as growers. My name is Alan Weber, and I work with MU's Center for Regenerative Agriculture, as well as the Circle program, which I know many of you that are joining today have enrolled in. So as you know, the purpose of our Circle program is not only to help incentivize some new practices on your farm, but also to help you understand what commercial programs might be out there in terms of carbon opportunities, which can help you monetize your soil carbon assets. Previously, we've had the chance to be able to hear from a couple of other companies, Indigo Ag a couple of weeks ago. Last week, we got to hear from Foreground by Bayer. And this week, we are joined by Joe Zoellner with MFA. So similar to our other presentations, we really hope to be able to address the questions that you have. So therefore, if you are new to our series, just as a quick reminder, there's a couple of different ways that you can ask questions. First of all, at the bottom of your screen on your menu, you should be able to see a Q&A button, which you can click. When you do that, a window will open. You can type in your question, and we will either ask Joe at the end of his presentation to answer that question live, or we'll type in a response for you. But please don't wait as you listen to Joe's remarks today as he overviews the programs. If you have a question, go ahead and type it in and get yourself in the queue. If you would prefer to be able to answer that or ask that question live, right next to the Q&A button, there is a raise your hand button, which you can also click on. I will be able to see that you've raised your hand, and when we have an opportune time at the end of his remarks, I will prompt you to unmute your mic, and then you can have a direct dialogue with Joe. So let's go ahead and get straight into our presentation today. And let me introduce Joe Zoellner, who is the Conservation Program Specialist for MFA Incorporated in partnership with NRCS. So he interacts with row crop producers throughout the northern half of the state of Missouri, spreading awareness and increasing implementation of soil, water, as well as wildlife conservation practices, while prioritizing the growers, your growers, individual production and economic goals. He regularly works to help keep producers informed on available cost share programs, as well as incentive programs such as Circle. And today he will be presenting on Truterra's 2025 registered carbon program. So with that, Joe, welcome.
Ron, I'll go ahead and get started. So yeah, this is Truterra's 2025 registered carbon program. Like Alan said, part of my job responsibilities are helping our producers stay aware of incentive programs and sustainability source providers out there that provide those programs for them. And Truterra is another one of those that I'm going to speak on today. Lindsay, you can click over to the next slide, please. So this is just kind of the introductory clause. The 2025 Truterra Registered Carbon Program is part of a registry-approved carbon project to provide financial incentives for carbon benefits generated from farmers implementing new regenerative practices for the first time in crop year 2025. The eligible geographies and crop types may create expanded opportunities going forward for farmers to engage through a Truterra supported experience. So one thing to note is that this program is currently in a expanded register enrollment period. It was originally set to close September 2nd, but was extended to because the acreage cap was not met. So if you're interested in this program, you probably need to act sooner than later, but still thought it was worth rolling out for crop year 2026. As you know, growers are starting to make their decisions as far as cover crop and spring tillage throughout the fall and winter months. So just another program to keep on your radar. And Lindsay, you can go ahead and click to the next slide. So this is just the program exclusivity clause. Kind of like we talked about last year with Bayers, a field may enroll in no more than one privately funded program and no more than one publicly funded program per crop year. And then a field in a publicly funded program may not be enrolled in another publicly funded program for the same practice in the same crop year. Some of these programs may have additional limitations around program exclusivity. Your Truterra provider will provide you with any documents on the specific details of additional limitations. Next slide, please. So this is the potential benefits of the registered carbon program for participating growers. You'll generate registry certified carbon credits, attracting a new segment of credit buyers, creating expanded opportunity, receive technical advice from a Trutera throughout the duration of the contract. The program covers a broad crop and geography eligibility area. It covers almost 15 plus crop types in 32 participating states. Uh, Growers will receive their incentive payment and two payment milestones, an advance payment to get some money in the to the growers up front or sooner than the traditional rollout, and then a secondary payment after your generated carbon credits are sold. Also, there'll be the option for multi-year contracting on top of the annual contract with opportunity for future payments and contracts. Go ahead. Next slide, please. So this is just kind of a recap of the eligible geography. See all the states that are covered with this program. Eligible practices are rotation based, which essentially means that adopting the practice on a new crop type, even if the grower's been utilizing regenerative practices for many years, makes it eligible. So that's kind of nice that it can catch some long-term users of regenerative practices as long as they're adopting it on a new crop type for the crop year 2025. Because the program is generating registry certified credits, certain county level adoption rates could impact eligibility. And that simply means that if the core practices I'll get into here in the next few slides are deemed county common in the county you're enrolling your field in, you will have to implement a supplementary practice to accommodate the core practice change. And Lindsay, next slide, please. And then this is just kind of the program framework. You can see your list of eligible crops. That covers easily most of what we have here in the Midwest. Again, the rotation-based clause, your list of core practices. Again, these must have been adopted in crop year 25. If you're interested in enrolling in the 2025 program, cover crop is covered. Strip till, no till, that does include or can include either strip till, no till, or one single pass of minimum tillage, which I'll get into more in the next slide about the core practice definition specifics. Addition of a legume species to an existing cover crop mix if you've been cover cropping. And then again, the supplementary practices would come into effect where if one of those core practices is deemed common in your county, cover crop enhancement would be a supplementary practice, and that refers to earlier establishment or later termination than what you've typically done on your farm. Crop rotation enhancement, incorporating a new cash crop into your rotation, or nitrogen enhancement management, reduced number of applications, use of a nitrification inhibitor, or an improved application method. There is no producer enrollment cap per producer, but there is a 1 acre minimum field size. And again, this was for the current information I'm presenting is 2025. But like I said, the program came out last June. So guys had already made fall cover crop decisions and spring tillage decisions and things like that. So he thought it was worth rolling it out for growers to have it on their radar now so they could keep this in mind if they want to utilize it next crop year 2026. Total product target enrollment was 400,000 acres. And again, that's just the exclusivity clause. Next slide, please. So these are the specific definitions of the eligible practices. You can see with strip till, no till, they've got it defined as a single tillage pass that deserves no more than a third of the surface area, which would be your strip till, or a single pass 1 to 3 inches deep of either seedbed prep, post-planting cultivation, or fallow tillage. The cover crop must be planted in the eligible field for the first time on the eligible crop type. It must be planted across the entire enrolled field and must remain planted for at least 30 days before any manipulation. Same with the legume species addition. If you've been utilizing, cereal grains or any other cover crop species for a while, but have added a legume, same specifications. It must be introduced utilized across the entire field, and remain to establish at least 30 days after planting. The supplementary practices, if you have to implement one of those because your core practice is county common, the longer duration, again, just relates to delayed termination, equal to or greater than 7 days normal than typical for your farm, or earlier planting, 13 days or earlier than typical for your farm. And then the cash crop addition of new cash crop is just adding a cash crop that was not typical to your farm's crop plan without increasing annual fallow period. Nitrogen management could look like reduced number of applications, reducing the number of applications 30 days before planting without increasing the total number of applications or increasing your total nitrogen applied. Then you could implement the use of a nitrification inhibitor or a slow release fertilizer product to your synthetic fertilizer application while still not increasing your total nitrogen applied. And it must be the slow release or inhibitor must be applied to at least 50% of your planned application. When you enroll in the program, your share provider can provide you a FAQ document and the insight that lists all the approved nitrogen products that meet that clause. And then the last one would be improved application method, moving 50% or more of your nitrogen fertilizer application to a lower impact application method, such as applying and incorporating within one day. Next slide. Again, this is just kind of the framework of how the program worked this year. I think it would be pretty similar in the 2026 rollout. The contract length is your initial carbon offer for crop year 2025 and a 5-year maintenance and reporting period. It is important to note that the practice changes, the core practice and supplementary practice changes you would implement in crop year 25 must be maintained through the reporting period to receive payment. So the farmer incentive moving down is 55% of the average credit market sale price. Again, the payment will be made in 2 stages. Your advance payment of $20 per ton after the credits are issued, and then a secondary payment after those credits would be sold, bringing that total to 55% of the average credit sale price. Again, for this year, they anticipate your advance payment would come sometime in early 2027, and the secondary payment would be in later 2027 or even early 2028. The data required to be submitted is a crop plan data metric for the current crop year and your 4 historical crop years. And these 2 are just kind of the deadlines for filing. Next slide. This is just kind of a scale of different payment scenarios. So you can see on the far left, you've got your average credit sale price per metric ton. You've got your advance payment, which Tratera established as a baseline of $20 per metric ton, and then your secondary payment, bringing your total payment to 55% of that average credit sale price. They do have a clause if market activity leading up to the advance payment window indicates that average credit prices are less than $40 a ton, the advance payment may be lowered. Tratera will be 100% transparent with you through that process, and the secondary payment will still bring it up to 55% of the average credit sale price. Next slide. This is just kind of an outline of the farmer journey through the program. Obviously, you begin with enrollment. You fill out a pre-enrollment form, enroll through their portal online. It's pretty straightforward, their online enrollment segment, creating a profile. You can actually enter your field boundaries, and it'll tell you if you're eligible for the program or not, along with your data. Once you have your data entered, it develops your farmer agreement, analyzes your data. They'll send you an estimated initial payment. They'll go through modeling and quantification to calculate your tons of carbon generated. Some farms may be selected for soil sampling, but not all, and they're just looking at your net tons of carbon through the soil sample. I'll get into that more here in a little bit too. Then you'll receive your offer. Some farms may have on-site verification in addition to the data collected through the program, and then you'll finish at your payment. Next slide, please. So these are just some scenarios and examples. Your commitment expected for the contracting period. You have your annual carbon offer for the 2025 crop year. Obviously, you must meet all eligibility requirements. You're unable to participate in a conflicting program for the 2025 crop year, and the farmer gives title to carbon rights for crop year 2025. You must complete the contract to receive payment for crop year 2025. And again, by implementing the practice change in 2025, you commit to continuing to utilize that uh, practice change through 2030. Uh, then the 5-year maintenance and reporting period. You'll annually provide field management data for all enrolled fields for 2026 to 2030 to prove that you're carrying out those core practice changes, and there be eligibility to re-enroll in future years. Uh, Next slide. So this is just an example of an eligible practice change to show some real life examples. They switched to no-till on corn in 2025, which would make this field eligible. Next slide, please. This is an example of where your county your specific county recommendations would come into effect. So he did go to no-till and corn on 2025, but it was considered common in Van Wert County, Ohio. So he would have to choose to implement a supplementary practice as well. And an easy recommendation for that might be to change his nitrogen management program. Next slide. So this is just reiterating the statement that you are expected to carry over the practice change through 2030. You can see the producer went to no-till and cover crop in 2025 from conventional till, made him eligible, but he does need to carry that out for 5 more years through the reporting period. Next slide. And then this is so the producer, he implemented what would be considered one of the supplementary practices in 2025, but did not change his core practice, as he's kept corn and no-till, but just added the nitrification inhibitor, so he would not be eligible. Next slide, please. Then this is just kind of transparency for the data collection Truterra is looking for. As far as the crop plans go, the producer may submit multiple crop plans per crop type, but for each field, the farmer must choose a crop plan for the current year and a crop plan for each crop presented in the baseline reporting period. For the historical seasons, the farmer will choose whichever crop plan is dominant and used most often in the rotation. Next slide. This is just kind of the framework of the data they're looking for in the crop plan, your tillage management, fertilizer management, implementation of cover crop, irrigation, manure use, or grazing. Next slide, please. And then they were also interested in the timing offset between certain management practices. Tillage, fertilizer, cover crops, and manure are really the ones they're looking at. And they just want to know your timing offset between, planting, pre-plant, in season, early, late, and then applications in the fall. And then with cover crops, it would be the interseeding after harvest or before harvest, sorry. Next slide. And then this is just for transparency if you're selected on soil sampling and verification. Next slide, please. So again, they're sampling for soil carbon content. No other tests will be done for other components such as nutrients. Farmers or other network providers will not be privy to the information from the samples. In the case of the farmer would lose access to that field, another site may be selected. If a farmer declines to all selected fields, it may impact their eligibility for the program. Again, not all producers will be selected for soil sampling, just a small subset. Next slide, please. And then this is just an overview of the verification process. If they, do the insight verification, one can be done remotely. The desktop farmers are asked to provide additional documentation, the specific information they've provided. If they do a site visit verification, an auditor and a Truterra rep will set up an appointment to visit with the farmer, have a 30 to 45-minute conversation to confirm the submitted data. Might ask to look at some of their equipment, specific to their practice adoption, just to verify, nothing nefarious. It'd be a third party auditor, and then sometimes a Trutera or network provider representative. Fewer people is generally better, just not to overwhelm folks. So, next slide. And then this is a link to stay up to date with Trutera's current programs available. Like I said, this program is going to wrap up enrollment here pretty soon. Currently they have another program enrolled, and it's just a data collection program. They're interested in collecting downstream data for like food, fiber, fuel, supply chain providers to assess their sustainability market, and it's based on whether or not you've incorporated regenerative practice or not for crop year 2025. And I believe their incentive programs $3 per acre. All the data you submit is aggregated, so it might be worth checking out. You can access all the FAQ pages and check tech sheets from this link as well. And next slide, and I think that'll be it, and open it up for questions.
Yeah, okay, so
Okay, so
great. And anybody that has a question, please go ahead and type that into the Q&A box or raise your hand, and we can get you unmuted to be able to ask that question direct. So, Joe, you provided a lot of details today, probably as much or more than all of our previous presentations. I personally really like the examples that you gave. These are like real world examples of how it may work, and a couple of questions that came in via chat. I think are just follow up to that for confirmation. So the first one came in is if as a producer, and this is kind of like one that was asked, I think, last week, but if a producer has historically just been planting cereal rye after corn and before soybeans, so a rye before soy, if you changed and started incorporating like a diverse cover crop mix before corn, is that practice eligible since you added a new practice in?
I think so, as long as I think it would catch it on the legume incorporation, as long as you were incorporating a legume into a mix.
And then another question which came in terms of the actual examples that you were giving. So if, as an example, and I think this is one you presented, but I'm just confirming that if you switch to no-till for the first time, but you are in a county that it's deemed as county common.
Common.
So even though if you had switched, you still would not be able to receive any type of enrollment for that particular acre for no-till. Is that correct?
Correct. Unless you implemented one of those supplementary practices, which was the longer duration cover crop, nitrogen management.
Okay. And so then I have a question that goes along with that then. So how, as a producer, how would we know whether or not a practice is county common for our particular county? Is
So
it
when you enroll with Trutera, or speak with your Trutera rep, they'll have a list that's provides all the counties they deem common practice in.
okay? Very good. So
Sorry,
James,
I probably should have included that in the slides, but
so James is asking, is there a minimum acreage enrollment in the Trutera program?
it was just 1 acre for field. There was no, minimum other than the 1 acre. The field had to be at least 1 acre in size to enroll.
Okay, great. So I'm not seeing any other questions in the Q&A. So if you have questions in the Q&A box, um, there we go. So William asks if you have any programs for pasture or forest land, and if not, are there any that are being considered internally at Trutera?
I can't answer that, just as keeping folks aware of these programs, and we're usually not made aware of them until like a week or so before they come out. So I will, certainly keep an ear out for anything that fits that mold. But right now, I can't attest to anything in the pipeline or anything coming out anytime soon, unfortunately.
Okay, great. And so James, I think that we've answered your question as well. So continue to go ahead and populate the Q&A box. Joe, I actually have a question as it relates to
Go ahead.
for the you noted that one of the eligible practices is crop rotation, new crop. And so one of the things that popped into my mind is at least in the county where we farm, historically there's been a lot of winter wheat, but not so much over the last decade or so. So acres are really reduced. So if you 15 years ago had winter wheat in your rotation, but the last 10 or 15 years have had nothing but a corn soybean rotation, if you pulled winter wheat back into the rotation, would that be eligible as a crop rotation new crop?
Believe so, because and I mean it would be worth verifying with Truterra provider first, but since they're only looking at, 4 or 5 historical years, I would think so that, that would still make you eligible.
Okay. And then kind of down the same line in terms of the circle program, obviously, in addition to cover crops, nutrient management is also one of the practices that producers can enroll in. And so, at least in the circle program, our nutrient management incentive is based around actually taking part of your nitrogen application and applying it split. So you could have some of it pre-plant, but then you would side dress at least a specific percentage of your nitrogen. I didn't see split application of nitrogen as one of the nutrient management options. Is it included in there and I just didn't see it
I
necessarily?
think that might be in line with the, a more efficient delivery option. And again, that's something that the FAQ document may define more in detail or be worth digging into with Truterra more, because I would certainly think it would be accepted.
Okay. So another one in the chat relates to data. And so there's actually two questions. The first one is others have talked about look back period. Is there a look back period with the Truterra program? So I'll rephrase that to basically say that if you have been doing cover crops, but you started 2 or 3 years ago, is there a look back period or does it have to be a new practice implemented in 2025?
To have been implemented in crop year 2025.
Okay. And then the follow-up was related to data, and you gave some of these examples, but anything else you can add around the historical data that would be required? Um, and I guess just to phrase it, like last week we talked a little bit about historical data. Some of it had to be delivered by producers, some of it could be by remote sensing. So is there um, any input you can give in terms of what the producers will be looking at from a historical data perspective for those previous 4 years you talked about?
No, just what was included in the historical crop plans, the specific management in regards to each year.
Okay, very good. And so let's see. Javier asks, you talked to give examples about the price of carbon, but you haven't talked about the averages that are being paid. Could you give us some kind of range? So essentially, if carbon is 50 or $60 a ton, how might that equate back on a per acre basis for the producer? I think is where Javier is going.
See, yeah, and from what I understood, I think it was kind of dependent on where the market was at the time. I don't really know that I could give a accurate range right now.
Okay. And then it looks like also coming in through the chat, there's just a comment that the Truterra, the data management program through Truterra has met its acreage cap this year, and so that portion is actually currently closed. It looks like for calendar year 2025, with the others that you referenced being open.
Okay. Yeah, it should be the data collection one that's open through November 1st.
Okay. And so let's see. So I don't currently have any other questions. Does anybody that is on today have any questions where you just want to go ahead and ask direct and raise your hand and I can unmute you? Okay. Well, if that's the case, then I want to make sure that, Joe, that we say a great big thanks. It's a lot of details that you presented today in terms of the examples and what would need to be done. Also want to make sure that those of you that are on the series today, that we do have recordings of the previous two presentations, and then Joe's will be recorded. It was recorded today, and we should have that up by next week. So if you want to come back and refresh yourself in terms of the details that were presented, you have that opportunity. And if you go into the chat, it looks like Olivia has dropped that link to the YouTube channel for the Center for Regenerative Agriculture, and so that you can have a chance to be able to review what you heard today or from any of the prior two. And with that, I just want to thank everybody. I know that this is a busy time. Harvest kind of snuck up on us and was a little bit earlier, maybe in terms of our corn, at least in Missouri, that we were thinking. So I appreciate everybody's time and attending. And Joe, a big thanks for yourself as well. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you guys. Appreciate it.
Yeah.